Hey everybody, this is Jason from Fuzzlord Effects, and you are listening to the Fuzz Life Podcast. In this episode, I wanted to sit down and talk about some different kinds of guitar pedal switching. We hear a lot online about true bypass pedals versus buffered bypass pedals, and more recently, a lot of people are talking about soft switching pedals that use a relay for the bypass system. So, if those things are interesting to you, I think you're going to want to stick around and listen to this episode because I want to talk about kind of the pros and the cons between different things. Is true bypass preferable? Is there a place for buffered bypass pedals? And why do companies design pedals this way? Before we get started, I want to let you know that you can keep up with what I'm doing on a daily with Fuzzlord Effects on the Instagram page at Fuzzlord Effects, or you can check out the website, fuzzlordeffects.com. And as always, you can check out these podcast episodes in video form on the YouTube channel, Fuzzlord Effects, where you'll also find lots of gear demos and other really fun to watch videos. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating, or share it with a friend, and let's get started. So let's just start off by talking about true bypass switching pedals, because I think that's the simplest to talk about and the easiest to understand. True bypass switching pedals actually use a mechanical switch that either route your guitar signal through your desired effect that's in the pedal, it's called a fuzz, for example, or it bypasses it and disengages the effect. So what happens when we're plugging our guitar into the input of a pedal, and even though the pedal is off, the circuit is on all the time waiting for you to turn it on. It's like ready. Just imagine it's like the switch is basically like some train tracks, and we're just going to say, do we want to route our input signal through the bypass, as in the pedal's off and we just pass the clean tone back out through the signal, or back out through the pedal and then into our amp, for example, or do we turn it on and then route our input signal through the circuit and then take the output of the circuit and connect that to the output of the pedal? I think the best analogy for true bypass switching pedals is basically like switching a train track. We're either going to take our signal from the input and let it go through one path that completely disengages the circuit and puts our clean tone back out of the pedal, or we completely disengage the path that allows our clean tone to pass through, and we route our signal through the effect pedal. So that could be a fuzz, for example. The good thing about true bypass switching pedals is when they are off, the circuit is completely disengaged from our sound. And when the pedal is off and we're in bypass mode, it's essentially like we just have a little piece of guitar cable inside the pedal, and it's just like our guitar cable is just running through the pedal. It is truly off, and the circuit has no effect to our clean tone. When we turn the pedal on, the pedal's on, we get to hear the desired effect that we're trying to use, and it's just very simple. One of the reasons that maybe you don't see true bypass switching in really large companies is because they often require a little more work from the tech to install. They usually take 6 or 7 wires, like there's an input and an output, and then a little jumper wire for the bypass, and then the input and the outputs going to the circuit board of the guitar effect. So as you can imagine, even if we design PCBs to mount on the switch that interface with the input and the output jacks in the circuit, for example, it just adds some extra connections. So to answer the question, why isn't everyone using true bypass pedals if that is a good thing? That's why sometimes when companies are just really ramping up production, it's not feasible. And it just kind of adds human error into it because a technician would sit down and then wire up all these switches. A very good thing about these switches, other than when we bypass the circuit, it's a it's a true clean tone. The other good thing about it is that because they are often hand wired and take a little more work, the way true bypass switching is implemented is just a triple pole double throw switch. And that's something that we can easily repair and replace for a very long time. It's just the way I think of it sometimes is kind of like old cars, right? Everything was just easy to get to. You just pop out a part, put in the new one. It's very easy to keep it running for a very long time. A lot of times with guitar pedals, the first things that ever give out on them usually is like a mechanical part like the input or the output jacks, the power jack, potentiometers, like the knobs that we turn and stuff, or the foot switch. So that's kind of the pros and the cons of triple pole double throw true bypass switching pedals. I say triple pole double throw because that's the most common part used for that type of switching. All right, now that we've talked about true bypass switching pedals, why don't we move on and talk about buffered bypass pedals? It's a very interesting topic to me. First of all, let's just talk about what a buffer is. A buffer is a very simple circuit used in electronics in every different format. What it is it's a very simple circuit that provides a very high input impedance and a low output impedance. They're commonly implemented with op amps or can be made with single transistors. You can even use vacuum tubes to make a buffer. It's a utility circuit. It's just one of those things. There's like gain stages, there's buffers, there's just very common different building blocks in circuits, and a buffer is one of them. One of the really good things that they do, having a high input impedance and a low output impedance, is they're very good at separating different parts of circuits from the other. Think of buffers like a wall. That's how I always think of these things. So without getting into too much of the details of these things, what I just want you to think of is that a buffer helps separate one thing from another. They have a voltage gain of 1, meaning they do not amplify circuits, but they provide other benefits like a high input impedance, a low output impedance. Sometimes they can have a positive effect, like they can provide a better current drive because they are so low of an output impedance. So basically, they're just a really good building block of a circuit that helps separate different things. When we hear about buffered bypass pedals, that means when you turn your pedal off, like you're in the clean mode, the bypass mode, even though your guitar pedal is quote unquote off, our signal is still running through a buffer. Meaning our guitar plugged into our guitar pedal, even though the circuit is off, we're actually running through a buffer. So we might be running through an op amp that has a gain of 1. So it's not actually going to amplify or decrease our signal at all. And if they're designed well, we don't even know they're there. So all of that was just a warm-up to talk about the real thing happening in buffered bypass pedals. Again, the keyword there, buffered bypass. When the pedal is off, your signal is running through a buffer. That's not a good or a bad thing. It's just the way it is, right? A benefit of that you always hear people talk about is like, oh, you can drive long lengths of cables better. Or you can, when you have all these pedals on your board, it helps push like your signal. Basically, it's like we're putting all these obstacles in the way between our guitar, that pedal, and the amp, like long lengths of cable, etc. And a buffer will help drive that. The buffer will help drive those long lengths of cable, for example. And a lot of that has to do with coming back to, again, that the buffers have a low output impedance. So they help transfer things that aren't necessarily an ideal voltage source, like a guitar, and then make it so they're transferred over on the other side of the buffer as being a much more ideal voltage source for the next things in line. Now, buffered bypass pedals, I'm going to talk about Boss One specifically. The actual switching is done with something called a flip-flop. It's another utility circuit that uses transistors in a way that acts very much like switching train tracks from one way to the other. And what's happening is like we give a little pulse, like a little 5-volt pulse to this flip-flop circuit, and our input signal, click, goes over one way towards the fuzz circuit, for example. And then we hit that little flip-flop circuit again with a little 5-volt pulse. Click goes over the other way to the bypass mode. Keep in mind, we're in bypass, buffered bypass pedals. Even when the pedal's off, we're still running through a buffer. You may ask, why is that? Why don't we just turn it off? Like when the pedal's in bypass mode, why not just have it work like the old way, like the true bypass switching? The reason for that is to keep the flip-flop circuit from interacting with our guitar signal, we have to buffer it. Remember, buffers help separate things. So that is the deal with buffered bypass pedals. Let's talk about some good and bad things about that. Good thing is, there's nothing wrong with buffers. Like a lot of folks will say, they can like help retain the clarity of your signal and high end, all these different things, or they'll help drive long lengths of cable. For the most part, if you actually had just a buffer in a box and you plugged one in, you probably wouldn't really hear the difference. These are kind of extreme scenarios, but in some scenarios in building blocks of circuits, they're very necessary. So really what's going on, buffered bypass pedals, is it's an artifact of the deal that we're using a flip-flop circuit for the switching. So we need to buffer our input signal to make sure that it doesn't interact with these things. But this leads beautifully into our next and final type of switching, which is the soft clicking or soft touch relay switching. So right when we got to the end of the buffered bypass part, and it was like, well, why don't we, instead of when we're using this flip-flop circuit that kind of like we choose between two different paths, basically like the guitar effect or the bypass mode, why don't we just like not use a buffer on the bypass mode? And this is where the soft switching comes into play. Soft switching are those pedals that we see now that instead of making a click when you actually step on the pedal, it's a spring-loaded switch. You just push it down, the pedal turns on or off. It's the same concept as like the old Boss pedals as far as the mechanical function of the foot switch. But here's the difference. They don't use a flip-flop circuit, and therefore they don't need the buffer to kind of help protect our guitar signal from it. So what they're doing, something very similar, but instead of using a flip-flop circuit, they're using something called a relay. A relay is similar sort of thing. It's like a switch that's controlled electronically. So there might be 6 pins on it, for example, so we can kind of like take an input signal and either switch it from one way to the guitar circuit to the fuzz, or the other way, off, bypass mode. And the way they work is, again, they take a 5-volt pulse, and they are actually a mechanical switch that's electronically controlled. So we give it a 5-volt pulse, and it literally goes click, and then switches over from one state to the other. Now, a lot of these soft switching pedals are also called clickless or silent switching pedals. And the really cool thing about that is those pedals have a microcontroller inside of them. Basically a very simple computer chip that we program. You can load them up with code that basically says, when you switch this pedal, when we click the switch, it'll mute the output for like 4 milliseconds. So when we actually hit that pedal, there's a audible clicking sound that happens. Like sometimes when we click on true bypass pedals, there's a good pop sometimes. Not all the pedals do that, but some do. So what they're doing is they have a computer chip inside, a microcontroller, that they flash with code. And then when we hit that switch, it mutes the output for just a couple milliseconds, just long enough to catch the pop. And then we're all happy, right? So here's the cool deal about relay bypass switching, also called soft switching, is it's basically mechanically or like electronically speaking, the function is the same as the true bypass mechanical switching. When our pedal's off and our guitar signal is untouched. When the pedal's on, we're routed through the circuit and back out the pedal. The cool thing about this style switching is that when it's off, we don't have that buffer in line with our signal. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds. Another reason that we keep seeing these being very popular in pedals, and if you'll notice, a lot of soft switching pedals have top mount jacks. You can install the relay, the microcontroller, and all the supporting circuitry that you need to make all this happen right on the circuit board. So you can have your top mount jacks and you can run in the input, right back out the output. And I'm talking your length of wire from the input and output in the pedal is 1 inch. Versus sometimes you'll see boutique pedal builders where, they're adding a lot of wire to your signal. Something that I pay a lot of attention to when I'm doing circuit design at Fuzzlord is to make wires as short as possible, right? Keep noise down. So the cool deal about this is our switch, our foot switch, only actually has 2 wires going to it in this style of switching. It's just a way to give a little 5-volt pulse to the switching circuit to tell it to change states. Going back to the true bypass pedals, the true bypass switch that we first talked about is going to have an input wire and an output wire from the circuit. Usually another 2 wires to control the LED, the indicator light turning on and off. And then a jumper wire for the bypass. And then another 2 wires, one for the input, one for the output. So what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 little wires, right? Versus 2 on the relay bypass switching, also called soft switching. So as you can imagine, it's more efficient for people building, 1,000 pedals at a time or 10,000 pedals at Boss or something to put these kind of, Boss isn't a good example, sorry, but Earthquaker devices uses relay switching on many of their pedals. It's very cool to see, very cool modern manufacturing methods. So I hope this episode was interesting to you and that you learned something. And let's just talk about the 3 things again really quick. We had true bypass switching pedals, which are just like a mechanical switch that just either routes our signal through the circuit or bypasses it in off mode. And it's just like a little jumper wire input to the output and then out to the amp. It's very popular with boutique builders. A lot of people like it because when their pedal's off, their pedal's actually off. The second option is going to be buffered bypass pedals, like Boss. For example, most Boss pedals, even when they're off, your signal is buffered. That, I'm not going to say buffered is good or bad. It's just kind of artifact of their manufacturing methods because they were using a flip-flop circuit to go between the guitar effect and the bypass mode. And to keep the guitar signal happy, they put a buffer to keep it from interacting with that circuit. Then the last one we talked about was soft switching, also called relay bypass switching, which is just kind of a hybrid of both. It's a little bit of the true bypass mixed with a little bit of the flip-flop circuit. So it uses a relay, which is electronically controlled mechanical switch, usually in conjunction with a microcontroller, which is a very crude, simple computer chip that we can code. So the code might look something like, if this pin sees a 5-volt pulse, do this, which then turns on or off the relay and on or off the indicator light. And then right when it's switching and we know that little pop is going to be there from hitting the switch, basically hard switching between our clean guitar tone and something with a bunch of gain. Sometimes that makes our amp pop a little bit. We hear a little audible sound. Well, that microcontroller is also coded that, okay, for the first 4 milliseconds after this happens, take the output of the circuit and ground it. Basically, turn the volume to 0. So I hope these things were helpful. And I want you to know that whether you use true bypass pedals, buffered bypass pedals, or relay switching, there's a time and place for everything. True bypass is cool. if you're running a bunch of 10 or 20 guitar pedals and you got all this cord and stuff, yeah, it would probably be beneficial to have a buffer on there somewhere. It's not something I would ever put any thought into because, you're likely to have a buffer somewhere on your board without you even knowing it. And then hopefully now you also have a little bit of an understanding for how these new soft touch or soft clicking pedals are working, the relay bypass switching. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the podcast. My name is Jason Johnson from Fuzzlord Effects, and you can keep up with me on a daily on the Instagram page at Fuzzlord Effects. This podcast was actually recorded after seeing a bunch of comments from people asking about what they wanted to hear more about, and I got a bunch of comments that people wanted to hear more tech talks and things about how guitar pedals operate and function and some of the design decisions that go into them. So, hope you subscribe to the podcast, like it, leave a rating. I really appreciate everybody that does that. And maybe share it with a friend because I am going to keep these podcasts coming every week because I really enjoy interacting with everyone. And be sure you stop by the YouTube channel where we can all comment and talk about these different episodes. Again, I'm Jason Johnson from Fuzzlord Effects, and I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out and listen to different things about pedals while I'm sitting here in my office at the shop. And as always, don't forget that the true secret to good tone is to sit down and practice every day. Look forward to talking to you next week.